this house. Oh, fucking hell. Ooh. That was a heavy one, no that was. There's a weaver's sign. Where's me light? There it is. This is from the cabin house. They built this house. So this is the bigger house. Do you know? A more sufficient house. With big massive. And they're big hinges. I'm going to go upstairs and then finish downstairs. A stone fireplace. Most of that is actually wood. There's plaster in between. It's beams of squared off wood with plaster in between kind of thing. I do.
Well, you're welcome to what we call the Pen House, the Pennsylvanian Log Farmhouse. Bit of a mouthful. So we abbreviate it down. But this house is not an original. Now, most of the buildings that you're going to see after this are original buildings, but the reason this is a copy is because the original still stands in Pennsylvania, and it's still in use, and we weren't allowed to bring the original over, so we had to make do with a copy.
Yeah.
And the reason we went to the bother of copying it is it's a copy of the second home that the Mellon family moved into once they became established. Now, you may have heard from some of my colleagues, and it depends who's telling the story, which bits you get of it. But whenever they reached the port of Derry, Londonderry, the Mellon family, Andrew Mellon, Thomas's father, fell ill to the point of dying. And it meant that they had to stay in a lodging house for about a month.
Yeah.
Now that's kind of equivalent to us, you know, being abroad somewhere and having to stay in a B&B or hotel for a month in an unplanned way, and the cost of that. Plus they had to pay for a doctor and medicine as well.
Yeah.
And that meant that before they'd even left the country, it had ate into their funds very substantially. So by the time they reached the part of Pennsylvania they were aiming for, where their family had already got settled, they were unable to outright buy the piece of land the family looked out for them. And so they had to do what folks do today. They had to take out a loan from the bank, what we'd call a mortgage. Not as long as the ones that folks pay for today. It was 4 years. So it doesn't sound too bad, sure, does it?
Yeah.
However, in the period they were paying it off, there was what we call in modern terms a financial crash, and the dollar lost its value. So they could no longer pay the loan off with cash. So what we're going to do? Well, according to Thomas's autobiography, they paid with linen sacking. Now this is very interesting because we've no record of them being weavers when they were in Ireland. However, most farming families would have had a working knowledge of flax.
Yes, yeah.
And they had enough knowledge to produce a coarse linen cloth, not the very fine stuff that was coming out of Ireland, but it had its own value. Because most things were moved around the world in either wooden barrels or linen or hemp sacking. And so they were actually able to produce enough of this to continue paying the value to the bank. Now it's extremely labour intensive. If you know anything about linen, it's brutally hard work. So on top of trying to establish a new farm and a new country and all the other knowledge that they had to pick up, this was a real extra burden on them. And had they not had that knowledge, they would have lost everything. Fortunately, they had the knowledge, and at the end of the 4 years, they got it paid off successfully. And into the 5th year, then they asked the community to come together and help them to build a new barn. That meant they could protect their livestock better in the winter period. And then in the 6th year into the 7th, they asked the community to come back and help them to build a new house. Now the house is interesting because it demonstrates one of the new things that coming from Ireland, or indeed England or Scotland, we had to learn, and that was a different building material. Because nearly everything, particularly in rural areas in Ireland, is built stone, field stone, not even quarried stone, just field stone. Whereas out here, the most abundant material was timber. Now, even if you had a bit of timber on your land at home, you were not allowed to cut it down. It belonged to the landlords.
Right.
So most folk hadn't even wielded an axe before, never mind, use the timber. So over here you have an abundance of it, and really high quality stuff, white oak and mahoganies and all these really good hardwoods. How do you work it? How do you cut it down? I'm sure you guys know if you cut a tree down wrong, somebody could get hurt. Certain timbers work well for particular jobs, and so on. Well, in his autobiography again, Thomas mentions that some of their neighbours were what's called the Pennsylvania Dutch. They weren't actually Dutch, they weren't from Holland, they were from Deutschland, from Germany.
Yeah.
And the Germans excel, even to this day, in building large wooden structures. And especially in the climate where they have a hot summer and a very cold winter, which we weren't used to. We wouldn't have that. So whenever all the community would come together, that kind of knowledge was shared. And so the Mellon family ended up building a German-style house.
Yeah.
And that's why we wanted to demonstrate what this looked like, because the different nationalities brought different skills that were shared. And it was a great time for the women folk when you had the community come together, because we led a very isolated life compared to back home. It was a great time to share knowledge about really crucial things, so things like herbal medicines. Whereas at home, Ireland and Germany as well were both overpopulated in the early 1800s. And that meant you'd people everywhere, you couldn't get away from them. Over here, it was, as I say, a very isolated life. And for the women folk particularly tied to the house, you mightn't see folks for, weeks, maybe months on end. So when you got together, learning things like this, because if somebody breaks a leg, gets an infection, and you can't treat it, chances are they're going to die.
Yeah.
And another thing then, herbal medicines, you also had to learn to hunt using a gun out there, which you can understand the gun culture in the New World, because out here not only is there an abundance of food running about in the woods that you didn't have at home, you couldn't use at home anyway, but you've also very dangerous animals, wolves and cougars and bears and snakes, things that, again, we weren't used to. So you have to get used to not just killing them, but using them. They said if you killed a wild pig, the only thing you didn't use was the oink. So if you didn't eat it, you made something with it. And to illustrate the point, we have our antler here. So you think, well, what do you use an antler for? In prehistoric times, there are different things, but you think at this time, what would they use it for? Well, wee man like this would be learning all sorts of all sorts of things. Never would you have heard the words in this house, I'm bored.
I'm sure, a job for.
So for example, if anybody got toggles on your on jackets, that comes from the end of an antler. So you cut off the tip of the antler and you get the kids to bore the holes. You would slice it then and bore holes, you can make buttons. You find and you can make spoons. Take that part there, you can make the handle for a knife. There was endless things that you could make from things out here. Things that you'd have never thought of, doing at home. From the fat inside the skin, then you could make things like candles and soap. You would seal jars. Now they wouldn't have had glass jars, they would have been earthenware jars like these, but just to demonstrate, as I mentioned, preserving foods. That would have been this time of year, we'd have been flat out preserving as much food. Because we're going to be snowed in. We all complained about lockdown, didn't we? But this was a literal lockdown, snowed in for 2 or 3 months of the year. So if you didn't have enough food preserved, our family just wasn't going to survive. So sugar water for fruits, salt water for vegetables, and seal it with animal fat, and that'll make it airtight. So there was endless things to do and learn and so on out here. to be self-sufficient. And if you didn't learn fast and you didn't work hard, you were not going to survive.
Yeah.
This is black and white, isn't it? So it gives you an idea of
It does.
a little bit of life and what it was like in these homes.
Is this a beaver pelt? What is this?
No, that's just a small red deer.
Oh, okay.
Beaver pelt has a very specific feel. That's very coarse.
Yeah.
But we might, one of our trappers, or one of the guys that does trapping, is out at the next building, so
Right.
you can ask him if he has his beaver skin.
Okay.